In the summer of 1944, a dark, cynical joke circulated through the mess halls of the German Wehrmacht. It wasn't a joke about the food or the leadership or the war itself. It was a joke about a specific machine and the men who died inside it. To the battle-hardened crews of the Panzerwaffe, the elite tank arm of Nazi Germany, the American M4 Sherman wasn't a weapon of war. It was a target. It was a slow, thin-skinned, undergunned metal box that they regarded with a mix of pity and contempt. They had names for it. The British, with their dark humor, supposedly called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter with the famous slogan, "Lights the first time, every time." But the Germans were crueler. They called it the Tommy Kochen, the Tommy Cooker. To them, the Sherman wasn't a fighting vehicle. It was a mobile crematorium for American boys. And if you looked at the numbers on paper, the German arrogance made perfect sense. By 1944, the Wehrmacht had deployed the Panzer V Panther. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. It boasted 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, which was effectively equal to 140 millimeters of flat steel. It carried the high-velocity KWK 42 75mm cannon, a gun so powerful it could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor from 2,000 meters away, over a mile. In contrast, the Sherman seemed like a bad joke. Its armor was vertical, a flat surface that invited penetration. And worst of all, in the early models, the ammunition was stored dry in the sponsons, right above the tracks. German anti-tank gunners knew exactly where to aim. A single Pearson round would ignite the propellant, turning the tank into a blast furnace in seconds. German propaganda seized on this. They convinced their crews that one Panther was worth 10 Shermans. They told their soldiers that the Americans were soft, a mongrel army of jazz-listening, gum-chewing cowboys who relied on air power because they lacked the stomach for a fair fight. By September 1944, General Hasso von Manteuffel gathered a massive force, the 5th Panzer Army. It included 2 fresh Panzer Brigades. Their crews were young, fanatical, and eager. They marched toward a small French town called Arracourt, expecting a slaughter. But arrogance is a blinding fog. The Germans were about to learn that war is not played on paper, and the men waiting for them in Arracourt were about to deliver a punchline that would silence the German laughter forever. To understand why the Germans were so catastrophically wrong, we have to understand who they were actually fighting. The Nazis looked at America and saw a chaotic democracy. They assumed that a generation raised in the poverty of the Great Depression would be demoralized, weak, and unwilling to fight. But they misunderstood the Depression. It hadn't broken the American spirit. It had hardened it. The men of the 4th Armored Division weren't born into a warrior caste. They were farm boys from Kansas who had kept tractors running with baling wire and spit. They were mechanics from Detroit who knew the internal combustion engine better than they knew their own wives. They were oil workers from Texas and steel workers from Pittsburgh. They knew hunger, they knew cold, and most importantly, they knew how to fix things. This mechanized literacy gave the American units a hidden superpower: reliability. While the sophisticated German Panthers were breaking their transmissions every 150 kilometers, the American Shermans just kept running. The Germans mocked the Sherman as a tractor, but they forgot that a tractor works every day. And leading these men was a singular force of nature, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. In 1944, he was just Abe. He commanded from the turret of his own tank, Thunderbolt. He was aggressive, violent, and relentless. Patton himself famously said, "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have a peer, Abe Abrams." Abrams knew the Sherman was inferior in a head-to-head duel, so he trained his men to fight differently. His doctrine was simple: violent execution. While the Germans were mocking the Tommy cooker, Abrams was training his men to exploit its hidden strengths. The Sherman had a hydraulic turret traverse that could spin 360 degrees in 15 seconds, twice as fast as a Panther. German doctrine dictated that a tank must stop to fire. American doctrine was to keep moving. If you stop, you die, he told them. The Germans viewed the Americans as reckless cowboys. Abrams viewed his men as a pack of wolves, fast, coordinated, and lethal. And as the fog rolled into Arracourt, the wolves were hungry. September 19th, 1944. The weather gods seemed to have sided with the Germans. A thick, impenetrable fog blanketed the hills around Arracourt. For the Americans, this was a catastrophe. Their greatest advantage, tactical air power, was grounded. The skies were empty. The Shermans were on their own. General Manteuffel ordered the 113th Panzer Brigade to advance. He believed the Americans, blinded by fog and terrified by the sound of approaching panzers, would retreat. Imagine the scene. You are an American tank commander. You are sitting in a cold steel seat, smelling oil and cordite. You know that out there, in the white void, are monsters. You know that if a Panther sees you first, you are dead. You have to get close, suicidally close, to have a chance. At 800 hours, the first contact came. Suddenly, shapes materialized in the fog. Huge, boxy shapes, the distinct silhouette of the Panther. But here, the German arrogance began to unravel. The German crews were fresh, too fresh. They were trained for long-range duels on the Russian steppes. They were not trained for a knife fight in a phone booth. The fog compressed the battlefield. The engagement ranges dropped from 200 meters to 200 meters. At 2,000 meters, the Panther is invincible. At 200 meters, it is vulnerable. The Americans reacted with the speed of the gangsters that the Germans feared. As the Panthers emerged, the Shermans opened fire. The air filled with the crack of high-velocity rounds. The first Panther burst into flames, then another. Panic set in among the green German crews. Their heavy turrets couldn't turn fast enough to track the scurrying American tanks. They were like giants trying to swat flies, but the flies had stingers. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams didn't order a retreat. He ordered his reserve companies to charge into the fog. It was a gamble that would have terrified a Prussian general, but Abrams wasn't Prussian. The Tommy cookers were charging into the fire. The battle that unfolded was not military precision. It was a brawl. It was a chaotic, swirling melee of steel and fire. Major William Hunter led his Shermans in a legendary flanking maneuver. Using the fog to mask his movement, he positioned his tanks on a ridge overlooking the German column. The Germans were moving blindly up the valley. Suddenly, the ridge erupted. Hunter's Shermans, utilizing their stabilizers, fired on the move, a tactic the Germans considered impossible. They would crest the hill, fire around into the thin side armor of a Panther, and reverse back down the hill. Shoot and scoot. The German perspective was pure horror. Their invincible frontal armor was useless because the fire was coming from the sides. One American commander, Staff Sergeant Jimmy Fields, found himself face to face with 3 Panthers. His driver slammed the Sherman into high gear. They didn't retreat, they charged through the German formation. The German gunners panicked. In their haste, 2 Panthers actually collided with each other at point-blank range. Fields destroyed both of them. The myth of the Ronson was being inverted. It was the Panthers that were brewing up. The American 75mm shells tore through the Panthers' flanks like paper. By noon, the battlefield was a graveyard of burning German steel. But the Germans weren't done. A fresh wave of Panthers roared toward the exhausted American lines. This was the crisis point. But Creighton Abrams didn't blink. He radioed his air support. "I don't care if you have to fly through the trees. Get those birds down here." Over the horizon, the whine of P-47 Thunderbolts. The Americans were about to bring the hammer down.
When the sun finally set on Arracourt, the landscape was littered with the burning hulks of the Third Reich's finest engineering. The toys had won. The scorecard was shocking. It was undeniable. In the days of fighting around Arracourt, the German 5th Panzer Army lost 285 tanks and vehicles. 2 full Panzer Brigades were effectively erased from existence. And the Americans, the 4th Armored Division, riding in the inferior Shermans, lost just 25 tanks. The Germans were stunned. General Montefeld later wrote that he could not believe the reports. He had been promised the Americans would fold. Instead, he had witnessed his elite Panthers destroyed by a force he considered inferior. They realized too late that they hadn't been fighting toys. They had been fighting a weapon system perfectly designed for war, crewed by men who possessed an initiative that the rigid German system crushed. The American soldier wasn't a cowboy. He was a citizen soldier who brought his civilian skills to the battlefield. When a tank broke, they fixed it. When a plan failed, they improvised. The Germans fought for the glory of the Reich. The Americans fought for each other, with a grim blue-collar efficiency. The Battle of Arracourt was the death knell of the German armored superiority myth. It proved that on equal ground, the American soldier was more than a match for the Aryan Superman.